with the economics of the pandemic. Moving ahead with that, Ebehi Iyoha is joining me right now from the United States. She is a columnist with StearsBusiness. Hello, Ebehi, and thanks for joining us. I know it's quite early there. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Nancy.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, pretty well considering everything.
Have you been working from home? Because there's a gradual easing right now in the United States. The economy is, trying to open up again. Speak to me about your experience there in the U.S. before you come back home.
Sure.
Because I'm home already. You are away.
So yes, there is easing. I'm in Nashville right now, and Nashville is gradually opening up, but I'm still working from home. There are plans for the university to open up in a multi-step process. So for now, everybody's still working from home, but restaurants and a lot of services are opening up. Of course, essential services have been open for a while, like grocery stores, etc. But for the most part, there's like a trend and a process of gradually opening up and things returning to some semblance of pre-COVID normalcy.
We'll come back to pre-COVID normalcy in a bit. But I know you're a student also in the United States. You're a PhD student, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the universities. Speak to me about how education has changed since this coronavirus pandemic. How have you been schooling?
So in about March, we switched classes online. So the rest of the semester was going from March until the beginning of May. And so basically classes switched online using, services like Zoom. You would have up to 100 students on a Zoom call attending classes. Professors had some leeway in how this was structured, but basically we kind of tried to deliver the same services just online. So office hours as usual, but then at least accommodating some flexibility. Because, for example, people went home, so we had people in different time zones. So you had to accommodate some of that, especially for tests. Test taking, some tests were done in real time, while some were done, converted to take-home tests that were longer and more complex to accommodate the fact that, there were people who wouldn't want to be taking the test at 2 a.m. if they were in a different time zone. So the semester has ended. Summer classes are starting up. And again, it's the same thing. So we've been given a lot of resources basically to help us tailor our classes to online learning. But it still remains to be seen what will happen in the fall when the fall semester starts in August, if classes will be fully online or if campuses will start to reopen. So that's still kind of up in the air for now.
Up in the air. Of course, for you guys that are there, you have the options. Here in Nigeria, education is still, we may not have as many options as the U.S. has. Anyway, but let's come down home now. So I'm bringing you back home. With your experience, of course, you're a PhD candidate right now in economics. You have a background in economics and all of that. Speak to me about what you think the rescue measures put together by our government to get us out of this pandemic quagmire.
Okay, so I think the CBN at least has been very proactive in responding, especially trying to deploy about 3.3 trillion in loans to different sectors and also suspending repayment schedules for small businesses. So the CBN has been quite responsive in that sense, especially given it's also deploying about 1 trillion to manufacturing to make sure that at least businesses are able to kind of weather the shock of this pandemic. The federal government fiscal policy response has been kind of mixed. And I think for the most part, I do support, so there have been complaints that, we don't have as much oil revenues as we are used to, given that the oil prices have fallen quite a bit this year. Yet the budget has only been revised downward, only by a little bit, from 10.5 to 10.2 trillion. But I actually think that's a good idea, because I do think that this is not the time for slashing budgets or for cutting down on government expenditure, because we actually need the government to support households. So the CBN is supporting businesses, but I think there needs to be more done to basically take this as an opportunity to establish a social safety net, a real one, that can really actually last even beyond the pandemic. So the disbursements that have been going on to individuals right now, they're good, but I really think one of the biggest gaps we have is actually in measuring data. For example, we've not had a census in a long time, over 10 years, actually more than that. And we don't actually know how many Nigerians we have. All our estimates of things are based on household surveys and basically on samples that we extrapolate to a larger population. So this could be an opportunity for the government to actually use its disbursements to individuals to actually try to record more. I think it's a pity that financial inclusion initiatives kind of got stymied because of some, stamp duties and charges. So we can't really rely on the financial sector, to BVNs, for example, to track everybody and to basically find out who is getting disbursements, how much, etc. But I think if this is really the time to take advantage of the pandemic in any way we can, and basically do a better job of keeping track of who is getting funding, how much are they getting, how much is it actually impacting their lives. So I think that more can be done, especially in terms of measurement and data collection as far as the social safety net goes.
I just put some things down from what you've been saying so that we can dissect it further. Let's start with what you just said in terms of data collection, in terms of data compilation. A lot of people will still say that we don't even know how many we are in Nigeria, first and foremost, because the surveys we get are perhaps from, foreign surveys or forecast prediction that will be 450 million people by 2050. We are 201 million people right now, according to the United Nations. National population will say, okay, we are not up to that yet. We are 198 million people. The last census we did, I think, was in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. So how much of data is essential, especially right now that we are fighting a pandemic? You also said something which was very crucial in terms of even the stipends we saw government giving, or the conditional cash transfer which government was giving to households. Most of it was given through cash. We have BVNs there. So what do we do right now to improve data? How can the data agencies also be helped, be supported at this point? Because data is key. Where you are in the United States, citizens were getting $1,200 to $200 check. They didn't need to come to their houses to give them the dollars. They just mail it.
Exactly. So I think, for example, they use their tax returns, right? So they use records of who has been filing taxes to basically get your address, get your bank account even, and do a direct deposit, right? But we don't have those structures, especially since a large portion of the population is informal. But I think the big issue here is basically leveraging structures we already have. So, for example, we have a National Identity Management Commission, and it's severely underutilized, and it is severely underfunded. So, for example, if at the point where cash, even if we're still having to disperse cash because, there are a lot of the poor people who actually need the money are not financially included at the moment in the banking sector, but at least take the opportunity as you're disbursing the cash to do some of the registration. Now, it doesn't have to be. So, there are different levels of, identity verification, et cetera, that have to be done. But at least at a base level, there are some basic things, for example, name, location, age, occupation, those kinds of things that you can use to start building a database and then improving on it over time. I think the main issue, though, is because, counting people and counting how many we are in Nigeria is a political issue. Right? It's actually a political issue because a lot of disbursements from federal to state relies on population. So, there's incentives to, inflate figures, etc. But at the end of the day, we have to bite the bullet and just do it right and collect that information. Because, for example, we have estimates of the demographic composition of the economy of the country right now, the population. So, what percentage is young adults, what percentage are children, but these are all estimates. So imagine trying to model like the spread of COVID and like the risk. So what percentage of your population is at risk because they are above 60? What percentage is at risk, at lower risk because they are younger? We don't actually know the true value, but we think, okay, our population is relatively young, so, but it's kind of shooting in the dark, to be honest. Without data, policy making is already difficult to begin with. But without data, yeah, basically shooting in the dark, it makes it extremely difficult. So I think right now we could actually leverage the conditional cash transfers that are being done to include those people in the records that we currently have, utilizing agencies that already exist, like the National Identity Management Commission, to include those people in databases we already have.
I still want us to stick with this data a bit because, like I say, what you can measure, you cannot manage it. And data, not just in terms of population size, in terms of demography, in terms of everything we're doing. For example, I don't know if I go online right now, I don't know where I can get how many people died, for example, today in Nigeria. That is data.
Yes.
Now that, we are fighting COVID, for example, okay, because we know NCDC produces data, okay, these are people that died due to the COVID-19, but what is their age bracket like? Do you understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. How many people die from malaria every year? How many, that's in Nigeria, I'm not saying the one, you understand what I mean? That I can just go right now and get it. How many pregnant women die? What can we do to, avoid those kind of things? Let's just suppose, okay, this year, these are how many people that died, or how many people even got better because of some of the things we are doing right. Yeah. I don't have any place right now to do that. Apart from the little things, I wouldn't say little because they've gone a long way though. The MBS is doing. That's why bringing out GDP numbers, poverty numbers, consumption patterns, capital importation, but it goes beyond that, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, exactly right. How do we don't have like a good centralized source of a lot of statistics that are necessary for understanding the country and understanding what's going on with our population, understanding what's going on with our economy. And I also think it partly has to do with, where the responsibility lies. I think we always tend to focus on the federal government because federal government is, the source, basically the source of a lot of funds for local and state governments come from federal government. Most states are not internally generating revenue, right? So we tend to focus a lot on what the federal government is doing, federal government initiatives. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing that can actually save Nigeria is decentralization, true decentralization of responsibilities, of accountability, of fiscal autonomy, right? So, for example, birth and death registrations are things that should be done at the local government level and can then be sent in real time to a central database and can be done quite easily. So I think there was an initiative, I don't know the status of it right now, but an initiative had been started, I would say in about 2011, 2012, it was externally funded to find ways of basically using, text messaging to improve our birth and death registration. I think it was funded by either UNICEF or the Gates Foundation. Don't quote me on that, but it was externally funded. And there are very simple technologies that can be deployed to make this happen. But what usually happens is we have local governments that are not fully accountable to the people, that are not doing their jobs well, and nobody is checking to make sure that they do. So we basically end up in a situation where everybody is looking to Abuja for solutions, for the answers, for everything. And meanwhile, everything can't be done at the federal level. That's just the honest truth. Some things need to be localized because keeping track of every single thing, of births and deaths and accidents and healthcare at a centralized level, first of all, it might end up being inefficient, and it usually is slower because you have to, collate and etc. But if everybody at lower levels are doing their jobs, then we wouldn't have as much of an issue. So I think at least this is where state governments, at the very least, could take an initiative, especially seen as, there are debates around how good or bad this is, but especially seen as during this pandemic, state governments have had various levels of responsiveness and have taken various levels of autonomy in their decisions as to how to react to the pandemic. Now, how about we take some of that autonomy to governing in general, governing not just in the middle of a pandemic, but governing in other ways, right?
This issue of data, I think we really need to hammer it a lot to emphasize it, even as we struggle with this pandemic, because data is very, very key. Data is very key. I don't know if I go into the FCT now, or if I ask the Minister of Education, for example, how many students are in Nigeria in public schools, I don't know if they will be able to give it to me. Say, Nancy, okay, there are so millions of people. I doubt, you understand what I mean? So it's not about just data for data's sake. It's data for economic planning across board. You understand what I mean? In terms of, okay, how many hospital beds do we even have in Nigeria? How many tractors are working well? How many are not working well? So these are the kind of things we need to have. So it's not about federal government coming up, President Buhari, and they say, okay, they approve so amount of. What are you approving if you don't know the state of what was on board, So I think data is very key. But let's also move to what you said earlier, talking about this is not a time to slash the budget. Why did you say so? Is this a time for expansionary budget? Where will that money come from?
So yes, it's definitely a time for, so globally, the world is going into a recession. That's just the fact of it. And it's affecting everything all at once. So usually recessions are happening, from one shock. So either the financial markets are crashing like in 2008, 2009, or you could have supply-driven, recessions, or you could have demand-driven. But now we're getting it in all of them, right? Because stock exchange is going down. Businesses aren't able to function because supply chains are disrupted because of the pandemic, and also, lockdowns, people staying at home, people consuming less, people also earning less, potentially, especially if, for example, you're in the informal sector and you're like a daily wage worker, you're definitely consuming less because you don't have as much money anymore. So we're being hit all three ways, and generally you want government policy, fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical. So in the sense that when there is a recession, the government should be spending more to basically help whatever sectors or segments are affected by the recession. And when there is an expansion, you want the government to save so that when there's a rainy day, the government can, respond. Unfortunately, Nigeria happens to be in a bad situation in the sense that we are just coming out of a recession, and we already were in a, for example, we have a huge debt burden to begin with, and so it's basically another recession is kind of hitting us out of nowhere. So, but it doesn't change the responsibility of the government, because what happens if you try to contract fiscal policy during a recession? You end up, this economy will shrink, right? And smaller economies means smaller government revenues. So you end up in this downward spiral of, okay, yes, we're trying to save money by not helping the economy, but then by not helping the economy, we earn less money, and then you keep doing that, and before you know it, your economy has whittled down to nothing. So all governments across the world are looking at increasing spending. Well, not all, but most are looking at increasing spending to support sectors in the households, businesses that are affected by this global recession and this pandemic. So I don't think that Nigeria should be an exception. Now, where will that money come from? Obviously, it can't come from internally generated revenue. It's not coming from our oil exports, because those have unfortunately declined at the same time. So yes, we are going for loans from multilateral organizations, and we're basically trying to borrow to cover up the shortfall. In the short term, I think it's a good idea. As long as we actually use the money wisely. So, For example, I don't think it's a good idea to borrow money and use it to fund the fuel subsidy. There is absolutely no reason why you should be funding a fuel subsidy right now, zero. But we should be using it to kind of boost the economy, support businesses, prevent the oil sector from even collapsing right now, businesses in the oil sector from going bankrupt, as well as other sectors like services that in the latest GDP report, the service growth, the growth of the information and telecom sector went down from 10% last quarter to 9% growth rate last quarter. And that's one of the biggest growth drivers in our economy. So supporting those sectors and making sure that as soon as, the world opens up again after the pandemic, we are able to react quickly and basically capitalize on some opportunities that are available, that will be available after the pandemic. So I don't think it's the time to slash budgets. And I do think it's time to borrow. But I think, first of all, we should be borrowing wisely and trying to get the best interest rates we can. And second of all, we should be deploying those funds wisely, not using them to defend the Naira from devaluation, not using them to support fuel subsidies, but actually using them in ways that will actually grow the economy or prevent important, crucial, critical sectors from collapsing.
Okay, nice perspectives there. Talking about subsidy, the NNPC and the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Timothy Silva, the NNPC GMD has also said they've announced that there are no subsidies anymore. In fact, the NNPC GMD told me on the show, perhaps was it March or so, or early April, and Nancy, the subsidies are gone forever. I have him on tape, and I hope that it's gone forever, so that we don't see it again on our plates, So I just needed to put that in. But you made a you made a point there in terms of we don't need those monies right now. We need those monies to be used in other sectors because we spend over 1.5 trillion naira subsidizing what? Petrol. Let's talk about the poverty numbers. I don't know if you've seen it. The poverty numbers, the recently released poverty numbers, consumption expenditure pattern by the NBS. Since we were talking about data a while ago, that we have from the National Bureau of Statistics, poverty, 82.9 million Nigerians are poor. They live below $1.90 a day, excluding Borno. Borno State was not part of that capture. The World Poverty Clock also says that we are the world's poverty capital of the world. President Buhari says he wants to pull out 100 million people out of, he wants to pull out 100 million out of poverty in 10 years. Just oppose all this data. Speak to me about what you think. Then we'll come back to if that pulling out 100 million people out of poverty will really work in the face of this pandemic.
So yes, the new NBS numbers, are based on, I actually like that they're based on consumption rather than income. So the poverty line was created based on basically consuming enough calories, about 2,200 calories for the average Nigerian, and then other non-food expenditures on top of that. And so I think it came around to if you're spending less than about 350 naira a day. And then the World Poverty Clock also has uses a slightly different poverty line, which is $1.90, whereas our poverty line ends up being something around 90 cents. So that's where we get a disparity in the World Poverty Clock numbers and the NBS numbers. But either way, that's quite a large number of people. How do you pull that many people out of poverty? In 10 years, it's doable, actually. Yeah, that is not impossible. But it takes a lot of targeted policy making that we don't have a great track record of. So, for example, you can't. There are limits to social welfare, so you can't you could try, I guess, you could try to take money and just give it to poor people and lift everybody up out of poverty that way. But ultimately, that doesn't really change the structure of the economy. It doesn't change the structure of production, and it's not even sustainable, especially for Nigeria with, revenue problems, given that the government federal government really doesn't have much money. The only way to really pull people out of poverty in any meaningful way is through growth and through growing the economy. How do we do that? First of all, right now, obviously, that's not FDI would be one, foreign direct investment, getting capital investment that actually will be used to create jobs, build businesses, support businesses, and it's not just government funded, right? So we are getting money from outside that's helping us to build our economy. For a lot of currently growing economies like India, Brazil, etc., FDI is a big part, even Ghana, FDI is a big part of their growth strategy. However, right now we're lacking in that department severely. In the latest capital importation report, I think at this point, FDI is about 3% of our capital importation. So we really don't have external funding supporting business growth and development right now. And even when we do, in some cases like the Gokada cases in Lagos, government policy ends up stymieing business growth. So I think at this point, if the Nigerian government is serious about, pulling people out of poverty, has to get very intentional and very serious about promoting business growth and attracting external investment. One sector, for example, that we seem to have been focusing on agriculture. I personally don't think that's a good idea. I think focusing more on manufacturing which there seems to have been a shift recently of focusing more on manufacturing, at least from the CBN, would actually be a higher growth opportunity. But in fact, I think we should leverage what we already have. We have an educated population relative to a lot of other countries with our same level of GDP per capita. We have a relatively educated population and a young educated population and a thriving telecom sector. So we should think about exporting services. There's no reason why, for example, Nigeria couldn't exploit being an ICT service exporter like India. And if we actually made a dedicated effort to promote these sectors, to boost their growth, we could pull millions of people out of poverty in a relatively reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, that's not happened. And, the government makes these claims and promises. It's actually very funny thinking this is the year 2020, right? And remember, we had a vision 2020 during Yar'Adua's time, and now here we are.
2010, 2020, perhaps 2035 now, or 2030, who knows?
Yeah, so there's no point making proclamations unless we see concerted action. We really need to make Nigeria a place where businesses, first of all, feel supported, at the very least are not hampered by unnecessary government regulation, parasitic kind of, fees that kind of squeeze all the lifeblood out of businesses. And the biggest issue right now is like uncertainty, right? So regulatory uncertainty is a huge issue in Nigeria. So imagine being a foreign investor, starting a business here, trying to open a factory, and then all of a sudden, the government has capital controls that, prevent you from taking some of your money abroad, or, the government slaps a huge fine on you because it's trying to raise revenue, right? So you want basically to project the image of stability and support, like pro-business support. We need to have a more pro-business stance as an economy if we want to have any hope of pulling poor people out of poverty, right? So,
okay. You said definitely that is doable. Let's see how that will be done. Of course, during this pandemic, so much to grapple with, so much to deal with right now, and to also pull people out of poverty. You need money to pull people out of poverty, but beyond money, you even need the ideas, like what you said, expanding the economy. You said something, but I want you to clarify. You said that the government is doing so much. Is it we should move away from agriculture to manufacturing? But I also thought about a lot of people are into the agricultural space in Nigeria. Can we move from the primary agriculture to perhaps secondary, tertiary agriculture in terms of agribusiness, putting together the value chain in agriculture, which is also along the manufacturing line. So I'm not just exporting cocoa. I should be making chocolate bars. You know, I should be making derivatives from cocoa, for example. Nigeria is the biggest cassava producer, the biggest yam producer in the world. We also have palm oil, but what are we doing? You understand what I mean?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest impediments to the agro-processing industry is actually in terms of transportation and storage. So for a lot of, so basically, you don't want to have to locate the areas that are best suited for manufacturing may not or processing may not be the areas closest to farms. So how do you get the goods? And for example, how do you get the goods from states that have worse electricity supply to states that have better electricity supply in order to process and where factories are located, etc. So transportation is a big issue. And I think rail services could go a long way in developing our cold storage facilities, etc. Because what actually happens with our agricultural sector is that a lot of produce gets lost and wasted from the production point, from the farm, rather than making it to any factories or even to markets. So if the government is interested in expanding the agro-processing industry, one big area is to ensure that transportation services are sufficient to link areas of production to areas of processing and potentially areas of export or sales. So that's one of the biggest, I think, areas for value added. But for sure, raw material production is a very small segment of the value chain in agriculture. So we need to capture areas with greater value added, like processing. But so far, I think most of our the government's efforts have been geared towards supporting farmers, which, on the one hand, yes, a lot of people are employed in agriculture, but to be honest, as agriculture gets more productive, there will be fewer people employed in agriculture because farms will get bigger, agriculture will get more mechanized. So it's not really a job creation sector unless we actually tackle these areas of agro-processing and manufacturing, creating value-added products from agricultural produce. We won't really, capture the full potential of our agricultural sector.
Just as we'll move towards the end of the program, let's talk about the consumption pattern. I guess you've also seen the report where Nigerians spend so much of their monies on food. In fact, out of the 40 trillion naira consumption expenditure, 22.7 trillion naira is spent on food. Most of that money is also food from outside the house. So speak to me about your calibration of that data.
Yeah, so I think it's actually quite normal when you think about it. As a household gets more wealthy, so the percentage of consumption spent on food decreases, right? So the reason why we have such a high consumption, I think it's about 56% of consumption, Nigerians' consumption is spent on food expenditure. And the reason why it's so high is because we have so many poor people. So think about it, the basics of subsistence. What do you need to survive? You need to eat. You need to have a place to live. But for the most part, you need to eat first, at the very least, to keep body and soul together, so to speak. So as you move away from subsistence, then you can spend more on other things. For example, transportation and housing, clothing, and then some other kinds of non-essential expenditure as well. So the more poor people we have, the greater part that food will play in our consumption expenditure. But the big thing that this tells us is that that means the most vulnerable sections of the population are very responsive or very affected by changes in food prices. So when food prices rise, because of increases in transportation costs or because the exchange rate changes given our imported food products, then a large segment of the population will be most heavily hit because that's the largest share of their consumption. So as far as when we think about government policy, what they should tell us is that we have to be basically proactive about ensuring that to support our most vulnerable populations, we have to be proactive about ensuring that food prices are not unduly unstable and volatile, so to speak. But it's not surprising given the structure of poverty in the economy.
What will not make the prices volatile? It's production, isn't it? If we really move into production. But what we've been seeing, especially around food production, the Anko Boras program from the central bank is there for rice. The central bank has also expanded into other products, tomato, cocoa, milk, and all of that. But as Nigerians spend so much money on food, from what you have said, that shows us that, you know, price changes would definitely affect the vulnerable people. All of us, not even the vulnerable, because we all go for food. It's just that the middle class and the wealthy among Nigerians may not feel the pain so much, like a person that earns 350 naira a day, you know. So just comment on that. The other aspect also is, do you also see opportunities in that data in terms of for people that are business savvy now and want to take advantage of that and say, okay, Nigerians eat a lot of food, spend a lot of money on food. That means perhaps the food business is also the way to go, or some other things around that data.
So I think one of the big factors that affects food prices volatility is actually transportation costs. So if transportation costs rise, then you can always think when transportation costs rise, fuel, for example, anytime we have fuel scarcity in Nigeria, what happens? Food in the market gets more expensive because goods are usually transported by road. Versus if we had rail, for example, it may not be as sensitive to changes in fuel prices because goods might be able to get to consumers by other means. But as far as opportunities, so one of the biggest opportunities as far as understanding the Nigerian consumer is that low quantities, selling in low quantities can be quite lucrative. So for example, we have Cowbell selling sachet milk, and being able to break down your quantities into smaller units that can be sold is really how you can really take advantage of the market, given that that first of all, these consumers, the bulk of consumers are responsive to price changes, and they don't have huge budgets that they can spend buying in bulk, buying sacks of gari, etc. So if you're going into the food services industry, basically food products that can be sold high volume but low margins and basically small amounts that can be broken down into as little units as possible to reach all those consumers would be the key to basically take advantage of consumption patterns in that sector.
Thank you very much, Ebehi, for joining me this morning. At least we've been able to dissect some issues. Thank you, Ebehi, and I wish you a lovely day.
You too, Nancy.
All right, I've been speaking with Ebehi Iyoha, who is a columnist with StearsBusiness. She's also a PhD student in the United States. Let's quickly